Excellent. Okay, well, there we go. So tonight's first story by M.R. James, Canon Alberic's Scrapbook. St. Bertrand de Comminges is a decayed town on the spurs of the Pyrenees, not very far from Toulouse, and still nearer to Bagnères de Luchon. It was the site of a bishopric until the Revolution, and has a cathedral which is visited by a certain number of tourists. In the spring of 1883, an Englishman arrived at this old-world place. I can hardly dignify it with the name of city, for there are not 1,000 inhabitants. He was a Cambridge man who had come specifically from Toulouse to see Saint Bertrand's Church, or St. Bertrand's Church, and had left two friends who were less keen archaeologists than himself in their hotel at Toulouse, under promise to join him on the following morning. Half an hour at the church would satisfy them, and all three could then pursue their journey in the direction of Auch. But our Englishman had come early on the day in question, and proposed to himself to fill a notebook and to use several dozens of plates in the process of describing and photographing every corner of the wonderful church that dominates the little hill of Comminges. In order to carry out this design satisfactorily, it was necessary to monopolize the verger of the church for the day. The verger, or sacristan, I prefer the latter appellation, inaccurate as it may be, was accordingly sent for by the somewhat brusque lady who keeps the inn of the Chapeau Rouge, and when he came, the Englishman found him an unexpectedly interesting object of study. It was not in the personal appearance of the little, dry, wizened old man that the interest lay, for he was precisely like dozens of other church guardians in France, but in a curious, furtive, or rather hunted and oppressed air which he had. He was perpetually half glancing behind him. The muscles of his back and shoulders seemed to be hunched in a continual nervous contraction, as if he were expecting every moment to find himself in the clutch of an enemy. The Englishman hardly knew whether to put him down as a man haunted by a fixed delusion, or as one oppressed by a guilty conscience, or as an unbearably henpecked husband. The probabilities, when reckoned up, certainly pointed to the last idea, but still the impression conveyed was that of a more formidable persecutor than even a termagant wife. However, the Englishman, let us call him Denniston, was soon deep in his notebook, and too busy with his camera to give more than an occasional glance to the sacristan. Whenever he did look at him, he found him at no great distance, either huddling himself back against the wall or crouching in one of the gorgeous stalls. Denniston became rather fidgety after a time. Mingled suspicions that he was keeping the old man from his déjeuner, that he was regarded as likely to make away with St. Bertrand's ivory crozier, or with the dusty stuffed crocodile that hangs over the front, began to torment him. "Won't you go home?" he said at last. "I'm quite well able to finish my notes alone. You can lock me in if you like. I shall want at least 2 hours more here, and it must be cold for you, isn't it?" "Good heavens," said the little man, whom the suggestion seemed to throw into a state of unaccountable terror. "Such a thing cannot be thought of for a moment. Leave monsieur alone in the church? No, no. 2 hours, 3 hours, all will be the same to me. I have breakfasted. I am not at all cold, with many thanks to monsieur." "Very well, my little man," quoth Denniston to himself. "You have been warned, and you must take the consequences." Before the expiration of the 2 hours, the stalls, the enormous dilapidated organ, the choir screen of Bishop John de Mauleon, the remnants of glass and tapestry, and the objects in the treasure chamber had been well and truly examined. The sacristan still keeping at Denniston's heels, and every now and then whipping round as if he had been stung, when one or other of the strange noises that trouble a large empty building fell on his ear. Curious noises they were sometimes. "Once," Denniston said to me, "I could have sworn I heard a thin, metallic voice laughing high up in the tower. I darted an inquiring glance at my sacristan. He was white to the lips. "It is he. That is, it is no one. The door is locked," was all he said, and we looked at each other for a full minute. Another little incident puzzled Denniston a good deal. He was examining a large, dark picture that hangs behind the altar, one of a series illustrating the miracles of St. Bertrand. The composition of the picture is well nigh indecipherable, but there is a Latin legend below, which runs thus: Qualite es Bertrandus liberavit hominem quem diabolus diu volabat strangulare. How St. Bertrand delivered a man whom the devil long sought to strangle. Denniston was turning to the sacristan with a smile and a jocular remark of some sort on his lips, but he was confounded to see the old man on his knees, gazing at the picture with the eye of a supplicant in agony, his hands tightly clasped, and a rain of tears on his cheeks. Denniston naturally pretended to have noticed nothing, but the question would not go away from him. Why should a daub of this kind affect anyone so strongly? He seemed to himself to be getting some sort of clue to the reason of the strange look that had been puzzling him all day. The man must be a monomaniac. But what was his monomania? It was nearly 5 o'clock. The short day was drawing in, and the church began to fill with shadows, while the curious noises, the muffled footfalls and distant talking voices that had been perceptible all day, seemed, no doubt because of the fading light and the consequently quickened sense of hearing, to become more frequent and insistent. The sacristan began for the first time to show signs of hurry and impatience. He heaved a sigh of relief when camera and notebook were finally packed up and stowed away, and hurriedly beckoned Denniston to the western door of the church under the tower. It was time to ring the Angelus. A few pulls at the reluctant rope, and the great bell Bertrand, high in the tower, began to speak, and swung her voice up among the pines and down to the valleys, loud with mountain streams, calling the dwellers on those lonely hills to remember and repeat the salutation of the angel to her whom he called blessed among women. With that a profound quiet seemed to fall for the first time that day upon the little town, and Denniston and the sacristan went out of the church. On the doorstep they fell into conversation. Monsieur seemed to interest himself in the old choir books in the sacristy. "Undoubtedly. I was going to ask you if there were a library in the town." "No, monsieur. Perhaps there used to be one belonging to the chapter, but it is now such a small place." Here came a strange pause of irresolution, as it seemed. Then, with a sort of plunge, he went on, "But if monsieur is amateur de vieux livres, I have at home something that might interest him. It is not 100 yards." At once all Denniston's cherished dreams of finding priceless manuscripts in untrodden corners of France flashed up, to die down again the next moment. It was probably a stupid missal of Plantin's printing about 1580. Where was the likelihood that a place so near Toulouse would not have been ransacked long ago by collectors? However, it would be foolish not to go. He would reproach himself for it ever after if he refused. So they set off. On the way, the curious irresolution and sudden determination of the sacristan recurred to Denniston, and he wondered in a shamefaced way whether he was being decoyed into some purlieu to be made away with as a supposed rich Englishman. He contrived, therefore, to begin talking with his guide, and to drag in a rather clumsy fashion, the fact that he expected 2 friends to join him early in the morning. To his surprise, the announcement seemed to relieve the sacristan at once of some of the anxiety that oppressed him. "That is well," he said quite brightly. "That is very well. Monsieur will travel in company with his friends. They will be always near him. It is a good thing to travel thus in company, sometimes." The last word appeared to be added as an afterthought, and to bring with it a relapse into gloom for the poor little man. They were soon at the house, which was one rather larger than its neighbours, stone-built, with a shield carved over the door, the shield of Alberic de Mauleon. a collateral descendant, Denniston tells me, of Bishop John de Mauleon. This Alberic was a canon of Comminges from 1680 to 1701. The upper windows of the mansion were boarded up, and the whole place bore, as does the rest of Comminges, the aspect of decaying age. Arrived on his doorstep, the sacristan paused a moment. "Perhaps," he said, "perhaps, after all, monsieur has not the time?" "Not at all. Lots of time. Nothing to do till tomorrow. Let's see what you've got." The door was opened at this point, and a face looked out, a face far younger than the sacristan's, but bearing something of the same distressing look. Only here it seemed to be the mark, not so much of fear for personal safety as of acute anxiety on behalf of another. Plainly, the owner of the face was the sacristan's daughter, and, but for the expression I have described, she was a handsome girl enough. She brightened up considerably on seeing her father accompanied by an able-bodied stranger. A few remarks passed between father and daughter, of which Denniston only caught these words said by the sacristan: "He was laughing at the church," words which were answered only by a look of terror from the girl. But in another minute they were in the sitting-room of the house, a small, high chamber with a stone floor, full of moving shadows cast by a wood fire that flickered on a great hearth. Something of the character of an oratory was imparted to it by a tall crucifix, which reached almost to the ceiling on one side. The figure was painted of the natural colours, the cross was black. Under this stood a chest of some age and solidity, and when a lamp had been brought, the chairs set, the sacristan went to this chest, and produced therefrom, with growing excitement and nervousness, as Denniston thought, a large book, wrapped in a white cloth, on which cloth the cross was rudely embroidered in red thread. Even before the wrapping had been removed, Denniston began to be interested by the size and shape of the volume. Too large for a missal, he thought, and not the shape of an antiphona. Perhaps it may be something good after all. The next moment the book was open, and Denniston felt that he had at last lit upon something better than good. Before him lay a large folio, bound, perhaps late in the 17th century, with the arms of Canon Alberic de Mauleon stamped in gold on the sides. There may have been 150 leaves of paper in the book, and on almost every one of them was fastened a leaf from an illuminated manuscript. Such a collection Denniston had hardly dreamed of in his wildest moments. Here were 10 leaves from a copy of Genesis, illustrated with pictures which could not be later than AD 700. Further on was a complete set of pictures from a Psalter, of English execution, of the very finest kind that the 13th century could produce. And perhaps, best of all, there were 20 leaves of unsealed writing in Latin, which, as a few words seen here and there told him at once, must belong to some very early unknown patristic treatise. Could it possibly be a fragment of the copy of Papias On the Words of Our Lord, which was known to have existed as late as 12th century at Nîmes? In any case, his mind was made up. That book must return to Cambridge with him, even if he had to draw the whole of his balance from the bank and stay at St. Bertrand till the money came. He glanced up at the sacristan to see if his face yielded any hint that the book was for sale. The sacristan was pale, and his lips were working. "If monsieur will turn to the end," he said. So monsieur turned on, meeting new treasures at every rise of a leaf, and at the end of the book he came upon 2 sheets of paper, of much more recent date than anything he had yet seen, which puzzled him considerably. They must be contemporary, he decided, with the unprincipled Canon Alberic, who had doubtless plundered the chapter library of St. Bertrand to form this priceless scrapbook. On the first of the paper sheets was a plan, carefully drawn and instantly recognizable by a person who knew the ground, of the south aisle and cloisters of St. Bertrand's. There were curious signs looking like planetary symbols, and a few Hebrew words in the corners, and in the northwest angle of the cloister was a cross drawn in gold paint. Below the plan were some lines of writing in Latin, which ran thus: Responsa 12 December 1694 interrogatum est inveniamne responsum est invenies fiamne dives fies viamne invidendus vives moriane in lecto meo ita. Answers of the 12th of December 1694. It was asked, shall I find it? Answer, thou shalt. Shall I become rich? Thou wilt. Shall I live an object of envy? Thou wilt. Shall I die in my bed? Thou wilt. A good specimen of the treasure hunter's record. Quite reminds one of Mr. Minor Canon Quatermain of Old St. Paul's, was Denniston's comment, and he turned the leaf. What he then saw impressed him, as he has often told me, more than he could have conceived any drawing or picture capable of impressing him. And though the drawing he saw is no longer in existence, there is a photograph of it, which I possess, which fully bears out that statement. The picture in question was a sepia drawing at the end of the 17th century, representing, one would say at first sight, a biblical scene. For the architecture, the picture represented an interior, and the figures had that semi-classical flavour about them which the artists of 200 years ago thought appropriate to illustrations of the Bible. On the right was a king on his throne, the throne elevated on 12 steps, a canopy overhead, lions on either side, evidently King Solomon. He was bending forward with outstretched sceptre, in attitude of command. His face expressed horror and disgust, yet there was in it also the mark of imperious will and confident power. The left half of the picture was the strangest, however, the interest plainly centred there. On the pavement before the throne were grouped 4 soldiers surrounding a crouching figure which must be described in a moment. A 5th soldier lay dead on the pavement, his neck distorted and his eyeballs starting from his head. The 4 surrounding guards were looking at the king. In their faces the sentiment of horror was intensified. They seemed, in fact, only restrained from flight by their implicit trust in their master. All this terror was plainly excited by the being that crouched in their midst. I entirely despair of conveying by any words the impression which this figure makes upon anyone who looks at it. I recollect once showing a photograph of the drawing to a lecturer on morphology, a person of, I was going to say, abnormally sane and unimaginative habits of mind. He absolutely refused to be alone for the rest of that evening, and told me afterwards that for many nights he had not dared to put out his light before going to sleep. However, the main traits of the figure I can at least indicate. At first, you saw only a mass of coarse, matted black hair. Presently it was seen that this covered a body of fearful thinness, almost a skeleton, but with the muscles standing out like wires. The hands were of a dusky pallor, covered, like the body, with long, coarse hairs and hideously taloned. The eyes, touched in with a burning yellow, had intensely black pupils, and were fixed upon the throned king with a look of beast-like hate. Imagine one of the awful bird-catching spiders of South America translated into human form, and endowed with intelligence just less than human, and you will have some faint conception of the terror inspired by this appalling effigy. One remark is universally made by those to whom I have shown the picture. It was drawn from life. As soon as the first shock of his irresistible fright had subsided, Denniston stole a look at his hosts. The sacristan's hands were pressed upon his eyes. His daughter, looking up at the cross on the wall, was telling her beads feverishly. At last the question was asked, "Is this book for sale?" There was the same hesitation, the same plunge of determination that he had noticed before, and then came the welcome answer, "If monsieur pleases." "How much do you ask for it?" "I will take 250 francs. This was confounding. Even a collector's conscience is sometimes stirred, and Denniston's conscience was tenderer than a collector's. My good man, he said again and again, your book is worth far more than 250 francs. I assure you, far more. But the answer did not vary. I will take 250 francs, not more. There was really no possibility of refusing such a chance. The money was paid, the receipt signed, the glass of wine drunk over the transaction, and then the sacristan seemed to become a new man. He stood upright. He ceased to throw those suspicious glances behind him. He actually laughed, or tried to laugh. Denniston rose to go. "Shall I have the honour of accompanying monsieur to his hotel?" said the sacristan. "Oh, no thanks. It isn't 100 yards. I know the way perfectly, and there is a moon." The offer was pressed 3 or 4 times, and refused as often. "Then monsieur will summon me if he finds occasion. He will keep the middle of the road. The sides are so rough." Certainly, said Denniston, who was impatient to examine his prize by himself, and he stepped out into the passage with his book under his arm. Here he was met by the daughter. She, it appeared, was anxious to do a little business on her own account, perhaps, like Gehazi, to take somewhat from the foreigner whom her father had spared. "A silver crucifix and chain for the neck, monsieur, would perhaps be good enough." I'll start again. "A silver crucifix and chain for the neck, monsieur, would perhaps be good enough to accept it?" Well, really, Denniston hadn't much use for these things. What did mademoiselle want for it? Nothing in the world. Monsieur is more than welcome to it. The tone in which this and much more was said was unmistakably genuine, so that Denniston was reduced to profuse thanks and submitted to have the chain put round his neck. It really seemed as if he had rendered the father and daughter some service which they hardly knew how to repay. As he set off with his book, they stood at the door looking after him, and they were still looking when he waved them a last good night from the steps of the Chapeau Rouge. Dinner was over, and Denniston was in his bedroom, shut up, alone with his acquisition. The landlady had manifested a particular interest in him since he had told her that he had paid a visit to the sacristan and bought an old book from him. He thought, too, that he had heard a hurried dialogue between her and the said sacristan in the passage outside the salle à manger. Some words to the effect that Pierre and Bertrand would be sleeping in the house had closed the conversation. All this time, a growing feeling of discomfort had been creeping over him. Nervous reaction, perhaps, after the delight of his discovery. Whatever it was, it resulted in a conviction that there was someone behind him, and that he was far more comfortable with his back to the wall. All this, of course, weighed light in the balance as against the obvious value of the collection he had acquired. And now, as I said, he was alone in his bedroom, taking stock of Canon Alberic's treasures, in which every moment revealed something more charming. "Bless Canon Alberic," said Denniston, who had an inveterate habit of talking to himself. "I wonder where he is now. Dear me, I wish that landlady would learn to laugh in a more cheering manner. It makes one feel as if there was someone dead in the house. Half a pipe more, did you say? I think perhaps you are right. I wonder what that crucifix is that young woman insisted on giving me. Last century, I suppose? Yes, probably. It is rather a nuisance of a thing to have round one's neck. Just too heavy. Most likely her father has been wearing it for years. I think I might give it a clean up before I put it away." He had taken the crucifix off and laid it on the table when his attention was caught by an object lying on the red cloth just by his left elbow. 2 or 3 ideas of what it might be flitted through his brain with their own incalculable quickness. A pen wiper? No such thing in the house. A rat? No, too black. A large spider? I trust to goodness not. No. Good God, a hand like the hand in that picture! In another infinitesimal flash he had taken it in, pale, dusky skin covering nothing but bones and tendons of appalling strength, coarse black hairs, longer than ever grew on a human hand, nails rising from the ends of the fingers and curving sharply down and forward, grey, horny and wrinkled. He flew out of his chair with deadly, inconceivable terror clutching at his heart. The shape whose left hand rested on the table was rising to a standing posture behind his seat, its right hand crooked above his scalp. There was black and tattered drapery about it. The coarse hair covered it, as in the drawing. The lower jaw was thin. What can I call it? Shallow, like a beast's. Teeth showed behind the black lips. There was no nose. The eyes of a fiery yellow against which the pupils showed black and intense, and the exulting hate and thirst to destroy life which shone there were the most horrifying features in the whole vision. There was intelligence of a kind in them, intelligence beyond that of a beast, below that of a man. The feelings which this horror stirred in Denniston were the intensest physical fear and the most profound mental loathing. What did he do? What could he do? He has never been quite certain what words he said, but he knows that he spoke, and he grasped blindly at the silver crucifix, that he was conscious of a moment towards him on the part of the demon, and that he screamed with the voice of an animal in hideous pain. Pierre and Bertrand, the two sturdy little serving men who rushed in, saw nothing, but felt themselves thrust aside by something that passed out between them, and found Denniston in a swoon. They sat up with him that night, and his two friends were in St. Bertrand by 9 o'clock next morning. He himself, though still shaken and nervous, was almost himself by that time, and his story found credence with them, though not until they had seen the drawing and talked with the sacristan. Almost at dawn the little man had come to the inn on some pretence, and had listened with the deepest interest to the story retailed by the landlady. He showed no surprise. "It is he! It is he! I have seen him myself," was the only comment, and to all questionings but one reply was vouchsafed. "Deux fois je l'ai vu, 1000 fois je l'ai senti." He would tell them nothing of the provenance of the book, nor any details of his experiences. "I shall soon sleep, and my rest will be sweet." "Why would you trouble me?" he said. We shall never know what he or Canon Alberic de Mauleon suffered. At the back of that fateful drawing were some lines of writing which may be supposed to throw light on the situation. "Contradictio Salomonis cum demonio nocturno, Albericus de Mauleon delineavit. Vi Deus in auditorium PS qui habitat." That's not it. Qui habitat. "Sancta Bertrand demoniorium effugator intercede pro me miserimo." And some more Latin and some dates I'm just going to skip past. I never quite understood what was Denniston's view of the events I have narrated. He quoted to me once a textum Ecclesiasticus. "Some spirits there be that are created for vengeance, and in their fury lay on sore strokes." On another occasion he said, "Isaiah was a very sensible man. Doesn't he say something about night monsters living in the ruins of Babylon? These things are rather beyond us at present." Another confidence of his impressed me rather, and I sympathized with it. We had been, last year, to Comminges, to see Canon Alberic's tomb. It is a great marble erection with an effigy of the canon in a large wig and soutane, with an elaborate eulogy of his learning below. I saw Denniston talking for some time with the vicar of St. Bertrand's, and as we drove away, he said to me, "I hope it isn't wrong. You know I am a Presbyterian, but I believe there will be saying of Mass and singing of dirges for Alberic de Mauleon's rest." Then he added, with a touch of the Northern British in his tone, "I had no notion they came so dear." The book is in the Wentworth collection at Cambridge. The drawing was photographed and then burnt by Denniston on the day when he left Comminges for the occasion of his first visit. And that's the end of that story. And yes, I apologise to those that know Latin, can speak Latin, can understand Latin. I can't. But boy, does James like it, so he puts it in his books, and you have to suffer me doing this. But yeah, that was That was Canon Alberic's scrapbook. And we have another one coming up in just a second. But hey, Ketai Cat, what's up? Something dilapidated Oregon. Yes, I glanced up and saw that. And had to carry on but not laugh. But thank you. But no, very good. I hope you're well. Wow, Cat with a good timing to actually possibly get up and want to go out in between stories. That's good. I'm also probably going to finish my tea so it doesn't get cold. Tea finish. Cat, are you going to go out? What if I try the door? Yeah? Door? Excellent. Yeah, a good few French words in there to try and trip me up as well. For some, like, if I'm trying to read paragraphs that are written in French, I feel like I would do a lot better than sort of switching between the occasional French word thrown into an otherwise English sentence. And for some reason, Comminges, my brain keeps trying to read as Cominges, and I can't. I have to, like, almost physically reach in and switch gears to swap to the accenting for that. So, yeah, that's the first story. The second one that I'm going to go on to, skipping past that one and this one. Ash Tree, how long are you going to take? Yeah, we can get through that pretty quick. Yeah. Alright, well then this is our next story for tonight. Possibly a 4, depending on how we go and how I'm feeling. This is The Ash Tree. Everyone who has travelled over eastern England knows the smaller country houses with which it is studded. The rather dank little buildings, usually in the Italian style, surrounded with parks of some 80 to 100 acres. For me, they have always had a very strong attraction, with the grey paling of split oak, the noble trees, the meres with their reed beds, and the line of distant woods. Then, I like the pillared portico, perhaps stuck on to a red brick Queen Anne house which has been faced with stucco to bring it into line with the Grecian taste of the end of the 18th century. The hall inside going up to the roof, which hall ought always to be provided with a gallery and a small organ. I like the library too, where you may find anything from a Psalter of the 13th century to a Shakespeare quarto. I like the pictures, of course, and perhaps most of all I like fancying what life in such a house was when it was first built, and in the piping times of landlord's prosperity, and not least now, when, if money is not so plentiful, taste is more varied and life quite as interesting. I wish to have one of these houses, and enough money to keep it together and entertain my friends in it modestly. But this is a digression. I have to tell you of a curious series of events which happened in such a house as I have tried to describe. It is Castringham Hall in Suffolk. I think a good deal has been done to the building since the period of my story, but the essential features I have sketched here are still there. Italian portico, square block of white house, older inside than out, park with fringe of woods and mere. The one feature that marks out the house from a score of others is gone. As you looked at it from the park, you saw, on the right, a great old ash tree growing within half a dozen yards of the wall, that almost or quite touching the building with its branches. I suppose it had stood there ever since Castringham ceased to be a fortified place, and since the moat was filled in and the Elizabethan dwelling house built. At any rate, it had well nigh attained its full dimensions in the year 1690. In that year the district in which the hall is situated was the scene of a number of witch trials. It will be long, I think, before we arrive at a just estimate of the amount of solid reason, if there was any, which lay at the root of the universal fear of witches in old times. Whether the person accused of this offence really did imagine that they were possessed of unusual powers of any kind, or whether they had the will at least, if not the power, of doing mischief to the neighbours, or whether all the confessions, of which there are so many, were extorted by the mere cruelty of the witch-finders. These are questions which are not, I fancy, yet solved, and the present narrative gives me pause. I cannot altogether sweep it away as mere invention. The reader must judge for himself. Castringham contributed a victim to the auto da fe. Mrs. Mothersole was her name, and she differed from the ordinary run of village witches only in being rather better off and in more influential position. Efforts were made to save her by several reputable farmers of the parish. They did their best to testify to her character and showed considerable anxiety as to the verdict of the jury. But what seems to have been fatal to the woman was the evidence of the then proprietor of Castringham Hall, Sir Matthew Fell. He deposed to having watched her on 3 different occasions from his window at the full of the moon, gathering sprigs from the ash tree near my house. She had climbed into the branches, clad only in her shift, and was cutting off small twigs with a peculiarly curved knife, and as she did so she seemed to be talking to herself. On each occasion Sir Matthew had done his best to capture the woman, but she had always taken alarm at some accidental noise he had made, and all he could see when he got down to the garden was a hare running across the park in the direction of the village. On the 3rd night he had been at the pains to follow at his best speed, and had gone straight to Mrs. Mothersole's house. But he had to wait. He had had to wait a quarter of an hour battering at her door, and then she had come out very cross and apparently very sleepy, as if just out of bed, and he had no good explanation to offer of his visit. Mainly on this evidence, though there was much more of a less striking and unusual kind from the other parishioners, Mrs. Mothersole was found guilty and condemned to die. She was hanged a week after the trial, with 5 or 6 more unhappy creatures at Bury St. Edmunds. Sir Matthew Fell, then Deputy Sheriff, was present at the execution. It was a damp, drizzly March morning when the cart made its way up the rough grass hill outside Northgate, where the gallows stood. The other victims were apathetic or broken down with misery, but Mrs. Mothersole was, as in life so in death, of a very different temper. Her poisonous rage, as a reporter of the time puts it, did so work upon the bystanders, yea, even upon the hangman, that it was constantly affirmed of all that saw her that she presented the living aspect of a mad divell. Yet she offered no resistance to the officers of the law, only she looked upon those that laid hands upon her with so direful and venomous an aspect that, as one of them afterwards assured me, the mere thought of it preyed inwardly upon his mind for 6 months after. However, all that she is reported to have said was the seemingly meaningless words, "There will be guests at the Hall," which she repeated more than once in an undertone. Sir Matthew Fell was not unimpressed by the bearing of the woman. He had some talk upon the matter with the vicar of his parish, with whom he travelled home after the assize business was over. His evidence at the trial had not been very willingly given. He was not specially infected with the witch-finding mania, but he declared then and afterwards that he could not give any other account of the matter than he had given, and that he could not possibly have been mistaken as to what he saw. The whole transaction had been repugnant to him, for he was a man who liked to be on pleasant terms with those about him, but he saw a duty to be done in this business, and he had done it. That seems to have been the gist of his sentiments, and the vicar applauded it, as any reasonable man must have done. A few weeks after, when the moon of May was at the full, vicar and squire met again in the park, and walked to the Hall together. Lady Fell was with her mother, who was dangerously ill, and Sir Matthew was alone at home, so the vicar, Mr. Croom, was easily persuaded to take the late supper at the Hall. Sir Matthew was not very good company this evening. The talk ran chiefly on family and parish matters, and, as luck would have it, Sir Matthew made a memorandum in writing of certain wishes or intentions of his regarding his estates, which afterwards proved exceedingly useful. When Mr. Croom thought of starting for home, about 9:30, Sir Matthew and he took a preliminary turn on the gravelled walk at the back of the house. The only incident that struck Mr. Croom was this. They were in sight of the ash tree, which I described as growing near the windows of the building, when Sir Matthew stopped and said, "What is it that runs up and down the stem of the ash? It's never a squirrel. They will all be in their nests by now." Excuse me. The vicar looked and saw the moving creature, but he could make nothing of its colour in the moonlight. There we go. The sharp outline, however, seen for an instant, was imprinted on his brain, and he could have sworn, he said, though it sounded foolish, that, squirrel or not, it had more than 4 legs. Still, not much was to be made of the momentary vision, and the 2 men parted. They may have met since then, but it was not for a score of years. Next day, Sir Matthew Fell was not downstairs at 6 in the morning. Next day, Sir Matthew Fell was not downstairs at 6 in the morning, as was his custom, nor at 7, nor yet at 8. Hereupon the servants went and knocked at his chamber door. I need not prolong the description of their anxious listenings and renewed batterings on the panels. The door was opened at last from the outside, and they found their master dead and black. So much you have guessed. But there were any marks of violence did not at the moment appear, but the window was open. One of the men went to fetch the parson, and then, by his directions, rode on to give notice to the coroner. Mr. Croom himself went as quick as he might to the hall, and was shown to the room where the dead man lay. He has left some notes among his papers which show how genuine a respect and sorrow was felt for Sir Matthew, and there is also this passage which I transcribe for the sake of the light it throws upon the course of events, and also upon the common beliefs of the time. There was not any the least trace of an entrance having been forced to the chamber, but the casement stood open, as my poor friend would always have it in this season. He had his evening drink of small ale in a silver vessel of about a pint measure, and tonight had not drunk it out. This drink was examined by the physician from Bury, a Mr. Hodgkins, who could not, however, as he afterwards declared upon his oath before the coroner's quest, discover that any matter of a venomous kind was present in it. For, as was natural, in the great swelling and blackness of the corpse, there was talk made among the neighbours of a poison. The body was very much disordered as it laid in the bed, being twisted after so extreme a sort as gave too probable conjecture that my worthy friend and patron had expired in great pain and agony. And what is as yet unexplained, and to myself the argument of some horrid and artful design in the perpetrators of this barbarous murder, was this, that the woman which was entrusted with the laying out of the corpse and washing it, being both sad parsons and very well respected in their mournful profession, came to me in a great pain and distress of both mind and body, saying, what was indeed confirmed upon the first view, that they had no sooner touched the breast of the corpse with their naked hands than they were sensible of a more than ordinary violent smart and aching in their palms, which, with their whole forearms, in no long time swelled so immoderately, the pain still continuing, that, as afterwards proved, during many weeks they were forced to lay by the exercise of their calling, and yet no marks seen upon the skin. Upon hearing this, I sent for the physician, who was still in the house, and we made as careful a proof as we were able by the help of a small magnifying lens of crystal of the condition of the skin on this part of the body, but could not detect with the instrument we had any matter of importance beyond a couple of small punctures or pricks, which we then concluded were the spots by which the poison might be introduced, remembering the ring of Pope Borgia, with other known specimens of the horrid art of the Italian poisoners of the last age. So much is to be said of the symptoms seen on the corpse. As to what I am to add, it is merely my own experiment, and to be left to posterity to judge whether there be anything of value therein. There was on the table by my bedside a Bible of the small size, in which my friend, punctual as in matters of less moment, so in this more weighty one, used nightly, and upon his first rising, to read a set portion. And I, taking it up, not without a tear duly paid to him, which from the study of this poorer adumbration was now passed to the contemplation of its great original, it came into my thoughts, as such moments of helplessness we are prone to catch at any the least glimmer that makes promise of light, to make trial of the old and by many accounted superstitious practice of drawing the sorts, of which a principal instance, in the case of his late sacred majesty the blessed martyr King Charles and my Lord Falkland, was now much talked of. I must needs admit that by my trial not much assistance was afforded me. Yet, as the cause and origin of these dreadful events may hereafter be searched out, I set down the results in the case it may be found they pointed the true quarter of the mischief to a quicker intelligence than my own. I made then 3 trials, opening the book and placing my finger upon certain words, which gave in the first these words, from Luke 13, verse 7, "Cut it down." In the second, Isaiah 13:20, "It shall never be inhabited." And upon the third experiment, Job 39:30, "Her young ones also suck up blood." This is all that need be quoted from Mr. Croom's papers. Sir Matthew Fell was duly coffined and laid into the earth, and his funeral sermon, preached by Mr. Croom on the following Sunday, has been printed under the title of The Unsearchable Way, or England's Danger and the Malicious Dealings of Antichrist, it being the vicar's view, as well as that most commonly held in the neighbourhood, that the squire was the victim of a recrudescence of the popish plot. His son, Sir Matthew II, succeeded to the title and estates, and so ends the first act of the Castringham tragedy. It is to be mentioned, though the fact is not surprising, that the new baronet did not occupy the room in which his father had died, nor, indeed, was it slept in by anyone but an occasional visitor during the whole of his occupation. He died in 1735, and I do not find that anything particular marked his reign, save a curiously constant mortality among his cattle and livestock in general, which showed a tendency to increase slightly as time went on. Those who are interested in the details will find a statistical account in a letter to the Gentleman's Magazine of 1772, which draws the facts from the baronet's own papers. He put an end to it at last by a very simple expedient, that of shutting up all his beasts in sheds at night and keeping no sheep in his park. For he had noticed that nothing was ever attacked that spent the night indoors. After that the disorder confined itself to wild birds and beasts of chase, but as we have no good account of the symptoms, and as all night watching was quite unproductive of any clue, I do not dwell on what the Suffolk farmers called the Castringham sickness. The second, Sir Matthew, died in 1735, as I said, and was duly succeeded by his son, Sir Richard. It was in his time that the great family pew was built out on the north side of the parish church. So large were the squire's ideas that several of the graves on that unhallowed side of the building had to be disturbed to satisfy his requirements. Among them was that of Mrs. Mothersole, the position of which was accurately known thanks to a note on a plan of the church and yard, both made by Mr. Croom. A certain amount of interest was excited in the village when it was known that the famous witch, who was still remembered by a few, was to be exhumed, and the feeling of surprise, and indeed disquiet, was very strong when it was found that, though her coffin was fairly sound and unbroken, there was no trace whatever inside it of her body, bones or dust. Indeed, it is a curious phenomenon, for at the time of her burying no such things were dreamt of as resurrection men, and it is difficult to conceive any rational motive for stealing a body otherwise than for the uses of the dissecting room. The incident revived for a time all the stories of witch trials and of the exploits of the witches, dormant for 40 years, and Sir Richard's orders that the coffin should be burnt were thought by a good many to be rather foolhardy, though they were duly carried out. Sir Richard was a pestilent innovator, it is certain. Before his time the hall had been a fine block of the mellowest red brick, but Sir Richard had travelled in Italy and become infected with the Italian taste, and, having more money than his predecessors, he determined to leave an Italian palace where he had found an English house. So stucco and ashlar marked the brick. Some indifferent Roman marbles were planted about in the entrance hall and gardens. A reproduction of the Sibyl's temple at Tivoli was erected on the opposite bank of the mere, and Castingham took on an entirely new, and I must say a less engaging aspect. But it was much admired, and served as a model to a good many of the neighbouring gentry in after years. One morning, it was in 1754, Sir Richard woke after a night of discomfort. It had been windy, and the chimney had smoked persistently, and yet it was so cold that he must keep up a fire. Also, something had so rattled about the window that no man could get a moment's peace. Further, there was the prospect of several guests of position arriving in the course of the day, who would expect sport of some kind, and the inroad of the distemper, which continued among his game, had been lately so serious that he was afraid for his reputation as a game preserver. But what really touched him most nearly was the other matter of his sleepless night. He could certainly not sleep in that room again. That was the chief subject of his meditations at breakfast, and after it he began a systematic examination of the rooms to see which one would suit his notions best. It was long before he found one. This had a window with an eastern aspect, and that with a northern. This door the servants would always be passing, and he did not like the bedstead in that. No, he must have a room with a western lookout, so that the sun could not wake him early, and it must be out of the way of the business of the house. The housekeeper was at an end of her resources. "Well, Sir Richard," she said, "you know that there is but one room like that in the house." "Which may that be?" said Sir Richard. "That is Sir Matthew's, the west chamber." "Well, put me in there, for there I'll lie tonight," said her master. "Which way is it? Here, to be sure." And he hurried off. "Oh, Sir Richard, but no one has slept there for 40 years. The air has hardly been changed since Sir Matthew died there." Thus she spoke, and rustled after him. "Come, open the door, Mrs. Chiddock. I'll see the chamber at least." So it was opened, and, indeed, the smell was very close and earthy. Sir Richard crossed to the window, and, impatiently, as was his wont, he threw the shutters back, and flung open the casement. For this end of the house was one which the alterations had barely touched, grown up as it was with the great ash-tree, and being otherwise concealed from view. "Air it, Mrs. Chiddock, all to-day, and move my bed furniture in the afternoon. Put the Bishop of Kilmore in my old room." "Pray, Sir Richard," said a new voice breaking in on this speech, "might I have the favour of a moment's interview?" Sir Richard turned round and saw a man in black in the doorway, who bowed. "I must ask your indulgence for this intrusion, Sir Richard. You will, perhaps, hardly remember me. My name is William Croom, and my grandfather was vicar here in your grandfather's time." "Well, sir," said Sir Richard, "the name of Croom is always a passport to Castringham. I am glad to renew a friendship of two generations standing. I'll have another go at that sentence. I am glad to renew a friendship of 2 generations standing. In what can I serve you? For your hour of calling, and, if I do not mistake you, your bearing, shows you to be in some haste." "That is no more than the truth, sir. I am riding from Norwich to Bury St. Edmunds, with what haste I can make, and I have called in on my way to leave with you some papers which we have just come upon in looking over what my grandfather left at his death." It is thought you may find some matters of family interest in them." "You are mighty obliging, Mr. Croom, and if you will be so good as to follow me to the parlour, and drink a glass of wine, we will take a first look at these same papers together. And you, Mrs. Chiddock, as I said, be about airing this chamber. Yes, it is here my grandfather died. Yes, the tree perhaps does make the place a little dampish. No, I do not wish to listen to it any more. Make no difficulties, I beg. You have your orders. Go. Will you follow me, sir?" They went to the study, the packet which young Mr. Croom had brought. He was then just become a fellow of Clare Hall in Cambridge, I must say, and subsequently brought out a respectable edition of Polyaenus, contained among other things the notes which the old vicar had made upon the occasion of Sir Matthew Fell's death. And for the first time Sir Richard was confronted with the enigmatical Sort Biblicae which you have heard. They amused him a good deal. "Well," he said, "my grandfather's Bible gave one prudent piece of advice. Cut it down. If that stands for the ash tree, he may rest assured I shall not neglect it. Such a nest of catarrhs and agues was never seen." The parlour contained the family books, which, pending the arrival of a collection which Sir Richard had made in Italy, and the building of a proper room to receive them, were not many in number. Sir Richard looked up from the paper to the bookcase. "I wonder," says he, "whether the old prophet is there yet. I fancy I see him." Crossing the room, he took out a dumpy Bible, which, sure enough, bore on the fly-leaf the inscription, "To Matthew Fell, from his loving godmother, Anne Aldous, 2nd of September, 1659. "It would be no bad plan to test him again, Mr. Croom. I will wager we get a couple of names in the chronicles. What have we here? 'Thou shalt seek me in the morning, and I shall not be.' Well, well, your grandfather would have made a fine omen of that, hey? No more profits for me. They are all in a tale. And now, Mr. Croom, I am infinitely obliged to you for your packet. You will, I fear, be impatient to get on. Pray, allow me. Another glass?" So, with offers of hospitality which were genuinely met, for Sir Richard thought well of the young man's address and manner, they parted. In the afternoon came the guests, the Bishop of Kilmore, Lady Mary Hervey, Sir William Kentfield, etc. Dinner at 5, wine, cards, supper, and dispersal to bed. Next morning Sir Richard is disinclined to take his gun with the rest. He talks with the Bishop of Kilmore. This prelate, unlike a good many of the Irish bishops of his day, had visited his see, and indeed resided there for some considerable time. This morning, as the two were walking along the terrace and talking over the alterations and improvements in the house, the bishop said, pointing to the window of the west room, "You can never get one of my Irish flock to occupy that room, Sir Richard." "Why is that, my lord? It is, in fact, my own." "Well, our Irish peasantry will always have it that it brings the worst of luck to sleep near an ash tree, and you have a fine growth of ash not 2 yards from your chamber window. Perhaps," the bishop went on with a smile, "it has given you a touch of its quality already, for you do not seem, if I may say it, so much the fresher for your night's rest as your friends would like to see you." "That, or something else, it is true, cost me my sleep from 12 to 4, my lord, but the tree is to come down tomorrow, so I shall not hear much from it." "I applaud your determination. It can hardly be wholesome to have the air you breathe strained, as it were, through all that leafage." "Your lordship is right there, I think. But I had not my window open last night. It was rather the noise that went on, no doubt from the twigs sweeping the glass, that kept me open-eyed." "I think that can hardly be, Sir Richard. Here, you see it from this point. None of these nearest branches can even touch your casement unless there were a gale, and there was none of that last night. They missed the panes by a foot." "No, sir, true. What, then, will it be, I wonder, that scratched and rustled so? Aye, and covered the dust on my sill with lines and marks?" At last they agreed that the rats must have come up through the ivy. That was the bishop's idea, and Sir Richard jumped at it. So the day passed quietly, and night came, and the party dispersed to their rooms and wished Sir Richard a better night. And now we are in his bedroom, with the light out and the squire in bed. The room is over the kitchen, and the night outside is still and warm, so the window stands open. There is very little light about the bedstead, but there is a strange movement there. It seems as if Sir Richard were moving his head rapidly to and fro with only the slightest possible sound. And now you would guess, so deceptive is the half-darkness, that he had several heads, round and brownish, which move back and forth, even as low as his chest. It is a horrible illusion. Is it moving more? There! Something drops off the bed with a soft plump, like a kitten, and is out of the window in a flash. Another, 4, and after that there is quiet again. Thou shalt seek me in the morning, and I shall not be. As with Sir Matthew, so with Sir Richard, dead and black in his bed. A pale and silent party of guests and servants gathered under the window when the news was known. Italian poisoners, popish emissaries, infected air, all these and more guesses were hazarded, and the Bishop of Kilmore looked at the tree, in the fork of whose lower boughs a white tomcat was crouching, looking down the hollow which years had gnawed in the trunk. It was watching something inside the tree with great interest. Suddenly it got up and craned over the hole. Then a bit of the edge on which it stood gave way, and it went slithering in. Everyone looked up at the noise of the fall. It is known to most of us that a cat can cry, but few of us have heard, I hope, such a yell as came out of the trunk of the great ash. 2 or 3 screams were there, the witnesses are not sure which, and then a slight and muffled noise of some commotion or struggling was all that came. But Lady Mary Hervey fainted outright, and the housekeeper stopped her ears and fled till she fell on the terrace. The Bishop of Kilmore and Sir William Kentfield stayed, yet even they were daunted, though it was only at the cry of a cat, and Sir William swallowed once or twice before he could say, "There is something more that we know of in that tree, my lord. I am for an instant search." And this was agreed upon. A ladder was brought, and one of the gardeners went up, and, looking down the hollow, could detect nothing but a few dim indications of something moving. They got a lantern, and let it down by a rope. "We must get to the bottom of this. My life is upon it, my lord, but the secret of these terrible deaths is there." Up went the gardener again with the lantern, and let it down the hole cautiously. They saw the yellow light upon his face as he bent over, and saw his face struck with an incredulous terror and loathing before he cried out in a dreadful voice and fell back from the ladder, where, happily, he was caught by 2 of the men, letting the lantern fall inside the tree. He was in a dead faint, and it was some time before any word could be got from him. By then they had something else to look at. The lantern must have broken at the bottom, and the light in it caught upon dry leaves and rubbish that lay there, for in a few minutes a dense smoke began to come up, and then flame, and, to be short, the tree was in a blaze. The bystanders made a ring at some yards' distance, and Sir William and the bishop sent men to get what weapons and tools they could, for, clearly, whatever might be using the tree as its lair would be forced out by the fire. So it was. First at the fork they saw a round body covered with fire, the size of a man's head, appear very suddenly, then seem to collapse and fall back. This 5 or 6 times. Then a similar ball leapt into the air and fell on the grass, where, after a moment, it lay still. The bishop went as near as he dared to, and saw what but the remains of an enormous spider, veinous and seared. And, as the fire burned lower down, more terrible bodies like this began to break out from the trunk, and it was seen that these were covered with greyish hair. All that day the ash burned, and until it fell to pieces the men stood about it, and from time to time killed the brutes as they darted out. At last there was a long interval when none appeared, and they cautiously closed in and examined the roots of the tree. They found, says the Bishop of Kilmore, below it a rounded hollow place in the earth, wherein were 2 or 3 bodies of these creatures that had plainly been smothered by the smoke. And, what is to me more curious, at the side of this den, against the wall, was crouching the anatomy or skeleton of a human being, with the skin dried upon its bones, having some remains of black hair, which was pronounced by those that examined it to be undoubtedly the body of a woman, and clearly dead for a period of 50 years. And it says here the cat was later discovered to be absolutely fine and living at home, and lived a long and happy life. And that brings us to the end of the ash tree. And I'm going to say the first half of tonight's reading. So, yeah, thank you everybody for listening to that. And hey, Budok, what is up and welcome. And Yumika, you too. Welcome and thank you for the sub. Yeah, exactly, Kitaka. I saw a woman do a thing and I couldn't not report her as a witch, right? I just, it's like, I'm just duty bound. I thought I saw a woman. I didn't actually catch her doing anything witchy, but I'm pretty sure I saw her. And extra witchy behavior, when I went and knocked on her door for 15 minutes, she'd clearly been asleep and woken up. That's proper witch behavior. I have it's only right to kill her. Yeah, right. I mean, I at least appreciate James as like, it's probably not very smart of these people to do these things. So, yeah. And, as much as it sucks that she was killed, no, exactly, hashtag no doubt she's a witch. As much as it's a bad thing, he says, doing the influencer holding a picture saying stop racism, as much as the witch trial sucked, at least she seemed to get some measure of revenge on the people that killed her. Obviously witches are like that, but at least the cat is okay, I guess. Yeah, exactly. Hey Salah, what's up? The cat, absolutely fine, definitely survived the whole thing and was all good. Also, I'm sure in the middle of that I heard Joey chirp and I looked around and he's fast asleep, so I don't know if he was like just chirping in his dream, but that's very cute and it's very important that everyone knows that. Anyway, I'm going to go take a break, refresh my tea, and just stretch a little bit. I'll be back in like a couple of minutes, so I'll chat while the break is rolling. And yeah, I'll see you, if I remember the right shortcut, see you back here in like 5 minutes or so. Bye for now. And hello, welcome back. Yeah, I didn't do a break command, but, you know, you're smart people, you can figure that one out. Yeah, how we doing? Hope everyone's well. Yeah, for those that missed the start of this, I mean, it's the information's there in the title, but these are ghost stories by M.R. James, noted ghost story writer. Back of the book says, considered by many to be the most terrifying writer in English. M.R. James, an eminent scholar who spent his entire adult life in the academic surroundings of Eton and Cambridge. I like the, yeah, I like that it's not sort of the framing of these fictions. It's like someone who is themselves collecting these stories. Almost like, oh, now Joey wants to go out. Okay. He'll be back. They always come back. Yeah, I like how these are... It's like James himself is a collector and curator of ghost stories and spooky events that have come to him. In a weird way, this is really almost a heretical thing to reference, but it kind of reminds me of the framing of the Dark Pictures games. Anyone's familiar with those from the studio that did Until Dawn? Having like this sort of curatorial figure who is like overseeing the stories. It just always kind of brings to mind that the voice, the perspective that he's written from is that same kind of character, someone who like collects these stories and passes them on. And nice, Sally, you love the spooky stories. Yeah, I've been doing some of the other ones. I'll read more in a sec, don't worry. Some of the I've just completely gone blank on the name, like the Cornish horror stories. I need to do some more of those. Although actually the ones I've been reading that haven't really been like reading myself to see what ones are good. Have been sort of less horror stories and just like, here's some stuff that happened and someone died and it was sad. And what was the... Gilchrist, that's it. R. Murray Gilchrist. Yeah, reading... I need to sort of go back and read some more of his stuff as well, because I have like a whole book of them that I'm hoping to... well, planning to work through on here, while Lucy's still banging through Monte Cristo. Story within a story is so lovely, you always enjoy it. Very 1001 Nights. Yeah, it's... yeah, because like, obviously, you know, James... It's a framework that I appreciate, because it gives the fantastical a sense of credibility to me. Like, if you just kind of write a story, a fiction, as like, oh, John went to this place and then saw a ghost and it was very spooky, then it's like, okay, sure, I'm reading a story. When you frame it like this, for me, I find it kind of tricks the brain just a little bit. That it's like, oh, wait, I know this is fake, but it's written like an account of actual events that happened, like if I'm reading I don't know, something a bit more academic or like a newspaper story or something, and it just feels a little bit more authentic and credible, even though it's obviously not. I enjoy that sort of framing. Exactly, it helps ground the beast. Yeah. So yeah, it's not something I need or like stipulate that, you know, my fiction must be written like this, but when it's used and used well, I do appreciate it. And so yeah, I think that's why I like these. Excuse me, just stirring my tea. This is some China Sencha. It's a green tea from Hebden Teas. Very nice. I've kind of got a little bit hooked on it. Blame Lucy for that. But it's very good, and I have bags of my own now, so I can just drink it whenever I like, which is great. Yeah, very delicious. But yeah, I guess I'll probably just do one more because of like how, yeah, I thought these would take a bit longer than usual, but normally takes me like, I don't know, say I get through like 60 pages roughly in about 2 hours, and these are less pages, fewer pages. Come on, let's get the grammar correct. Fewer pages than that, but yeah, I think the text is just denser. Excuse me, but yeah, I keep thinking of other things that I was going to say and then forgetting what I was going to say, so that's good. Yeah, this next one. All right, yeah, this next one is set in Denmark, and is gonna have a bit of Danish pronunciation, which, oh, you better believe I'm going to get wrong. Even had me looking up earlier to see how Copenhagen is pronounced properly, because if I'm going to make an effort, I might as well make an effort. And I found immediately conflicting examples. One saying everyone tries to pronounce it Copenhagen, and that's wrong. Just say Copenhagen. And another one that's like, no, Copenhagen. Like, oh, okay. Great, so there's conflict on this. So we'll just go with whatever comes out of my mouth at the time when I read the word. And there's going to be a few others as well, probably. So that's going to be fun. Look out for that. You've never gotten grammar correct in your life, you won't judge. And surely my pronunciation will be fine. I hope so. And thank you. That's reassuring to read. But yeah, do I have anything else that I need to say or want to say? I guess not. Yeah, so I suppose might as well crack on with the next story. This is still by M.R. James. Number 13. Among the towns of Jutland, Viborg. I've already screwed up. Let's just walk it back and start it again, because I can manage pronunciation and understand the cues that this punctuation has given me. Okay, once again. By M.R. James. Number 13. Among the towns of Jutland, Viborg justly holds a high place. It is the seat of a bishopric. It has a handsome but almost entirely new cathedral, a charming garden, a lake of great beauty, and many storks. Near it is Hald, accounted one of the prettiest things in Denmark, and hard by is Finderup, where Mask Stig murdered King Eric Glipping on St. Cecilia's Day in the year 1286. 56 blows of square-headed iron maces were traced on Eric's skull when his tomb was opened in the 17th century. But I am not writing a guidebook. There are good hotels in Viborg. Chrysler's and the Phoenix are all that can be desired, but my cousin, whose experiences I have to tell you now, went to the Golden Lion the first time that he visited Viborg. He has not been there since, and the following pages will perhaps explain the reason of his abstention. The Golden Lion is one of the very few houses in the town that were not destroyed in the Great Fire of 1726, which practically demolished the cathedral, Sorgenkirk, the Radhus, and so much else that was old and interesting. It is a great red brick house, that is, the front is of brick, with Corby steps on the gables and a text over the door, but the courtyard into which the omnibus drives is of black and white cagework in wood and plaster. The sun was declining in the heavens when my cousin walked up to the door, and the light smote full upon the imposing facade of the house. He was delighted with the old-fashioned aspect of the place, and promised himself a thoroughly satisfactory and amusing stay in an inn so typical of old Jutland. It was not business in the ordinary sense of the word that had brought Mr. Anderson to Viborg. He was engaged upon some researches into the church history of Denmark, and it had come to his knowledge that in the Rigsarkiv of Viborg there were papers saved from the fire relating to the last days of Roman Catholicism in the country. He proposed, therefore, to spend a considerable time, perhaps as much as a fortnight or 3 weeks, in examining and copying these, and he hoped that the Golden Lion would be able to give him a room of sufficient size to serve alike as a bedroom and a study. His wishes were explained to the landlord, and, after a certain amount of thought, the latter suggested that perhaps it might be the best way for the gentleman to look at 1 or 2 of the larger rooms and pick one for himself. It seemed a good idea. The top floor was soon rejected as entailing too much getting upstairs after the day's work. The second floor contained no room of exactly the dimensions required. But on the first floor there was a choice of 2 or 3 rooms which would, so far as size went, suit admirably. The landlord was strongly in favour of number 17, but Mr. Anderson pointed out that its window commanded only the blank wall of the next house, and it would be very dark in the afternoon. Either number 12 or number 14 would be better, for both of them looked on the street, and the bright evening light and the pretty view would more than compensate him for the additional amount of noise. Eventually, number 12 was selected. Like its neighbours, it had 3 windows, all on one side of the room. It was fairly high and unusually long. There was, of course, no fireplace, but the stove was handsome and rather old, a cast iron erection on the side of which was a representation of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and the inscription First Book of Moses, chapter 22, above. Nothing else in the room was remarkable. The only interesting picture was an old coloured print of the town, date about 1820. Supper time was approaching, but when Anderson, refreshed by the ordinary ablutions, descended the staircase, there were still a few minutes before the bell rang. He devoted them to examining the list of his fellow lodgers. As is usual in Denmark, their names were displayed on a large blackboard, divided into columns and lines, the numbers of the rooms being painted in the beginning of each line. The list was not exciting. There was an advocate, or sagfører, a German, and some bagmen from Copenhagen. The one and only point which suggested any food for thought was the absence of any number 13 from the tail of the rooms, and even this was a thing which Anderson had already noticed 6 times in his experience of Danish hotels. He could not help wondering whether the objection to that particular number, common as it is, was so widespread and so strong as to make it difficult to let a room so ticketed, and he resolved to ask the landlord if he and his colleagues in the profession had actually met with many clients who refused to be accommodated in the 13th room. He had nothing to tell me, I am giving the story as I heard it from him, about what passed at supper, and the evening, which was spent in unpacking and arranging his clothes, books, and papers, was not more eventful. Towards 11 o'clock he resolved to go to bed, but with him, as with a good many other people nowadays, an almost necessary preliminary to bed, if he meant to sleep, was the reading of a few pages of print, and he now remembered that the particular book which he had been reading in the train and which alone would satisfy him at the present moment, was in the pocket of his greatcoat, then hanging on a peg outside the dining room. To run down and secure it was the work of a moment, and, as the passages were by no means dark, it was not difficult for him to find his way back to his own door. So, at least, he thought. But when he arrived there and turned the handle, the door entirely refused to open, and he caught the sound of a hasty movement towards it from within. He had tried the wrong door, of course. Was his own room to the right or to the left? He glanced at the number. It was 13. His room would be on the left, and so it was. And not before he had been in bed for some minutes, had read his wanted 3 or 4 pages of his book, blown out his light, and turned over to go to sleep, did it occur to him that, whereas on the blackboard of the hotel there had been no number 13, there was undoubtedly a room numbered 13 in the hotel. He felt rather sorry that he had not chosen it for his own. Perhaps he might have done the landlord a little service by occupying it, and given him the chance of saying that a well-born English gentleman had lived in it for 3 weeks and liked it very much. But probably it was used as a servant's room or something of the kind. After all, it was most likely not so large or good a room as his own, and he looked drowsily about the room, which was fairly perceptible in the half-light from the street lamp. It was a curious effect, he thought. Rooms usually look larger in a dim light than a full one, but this seemed to have contracted in length and grown proportionately higher. Well, sleep was more important than these vague ruminations, and to sleep he went. On the day after his arrival, Andersen attacked the Rigarskiv of Viborg. He was, as one might expect in Denmark, kindly received, and access to all that he wished to see was made as easy for him as possible. The documents laid before him were far more numerous and interesting than he had at all anticipated. Besides official papers, there was a large bundle of correspondence relating to Bishop Jürgen Fries, the last Roman Catholic who held the see, and in these there cropped up many amusing and what are called intimate details of private life and individual character. There was much talk of a house owned by the bishop, but not inhabited by him, in the town. Its tenant was apparently somewhat of a scandal and a stumbling block to the reforming party. He was a disgrace, they wrote, to the city. Excuse me 1 second. Just adjusting my seating position. He was a disgrace to the city. He practiced secret and wicked arts, and had sold his soul to the enemy. It was of a piece with this gross corruption and superstition of the Babylonish Church that such a viper and blood-sucking Troldmund should be patronized and harboured by the bishop. The bishop met these reproaches boldly. He protested his own abhorrence of all such things as secret arts, and required his antagonists to bring the matter before the proper court, of course the spiritual court, and sift it to the bottom. No one could be more ready and willing than himself to condemn Mag Nicholas Franken if the evidence showed him to have been guilty of any of the crimes informally alleged against him. Andersen had not time to do more than glance at the next letter of the Protestant leader, Rasmus Nielsen, before the record office was closed for the day, but he gathered its general tenor, which was to the effect that Christian men were now no longer bound by the decisions of bishops of Rome, and that the bishop's court was not, and could not be, a fit or competent tribunal to judge so grave and weighty a cause. On leaving the office, Mr. Andersen was accompanied by the old gentleman who presided over it, and, as they walked, the conversation very naturally turned to the papers of which I have just been speaking. Herr Scavenius, the archivist of Viborg, though very well informed as to the general run of the documents under his charge, was not a specialist in those of the Reformation period. He was much interested in what Andersen had to tell him about them. He looked forward with great pleasure, he said, to seeing the publication in which Mr. Andersen spoke of embodying their contents. "This house of the Bishop Fries," he added, "it is a great puzzle to me where it can have stood. I have studied carefully the topography of old Viborg, but it is most unlucky. Of the old terrier of the bishop's property, which was made in 1560, and of which we have the greater part of the archive, Just the piece which had the list of the town property is missing. Never mind. Perhaps I shall someday succeed to find him. After taking some exercise, I forget exactly how or where, Anderson went back to the Golden Lion, his supper, his game of patience, and his bed. On the way to his room, it occurred to him that he had forgotten to talk to the landlord about the omission of number 13 from the hotel, and also that he might as well make sure that number 13 did actually exist before he made any reference to the matter. The decision was not difficult to arrive at. There was the door with its number as plain as could be, and work of some kind was evidently going on inside, for, as he neared the door, he could hear footsteps and voices, or a voice, within. During the few seconds in which he halted to make sure of the number, the footsteps ceased, seemingly very near the door, and he was a little startled at hearing a quick hissing breathing as of a person in strong excitement. He went on to his own room, and again he was surprised to find how much smaller it seemed now than it had when he had selected it. It was a slight disappointment, but only slight. If he found it really not large enough, he could very easily shift to another. In the meantime, he wanted something, as far as I remember it was a pocket handkerchief, out of his portmanteau, which had been placed by the porter on a very inadequate trestle or stool against the wall at the farthest end of the room from his bed. Here was a very curious thing. The portmanteau was not to be seen. It had been moved by officious servants. Doubtless the contents had been put in the wardrobe. No, none of them were there. This was vexatious. The idea of a theft he dismissed at once. Such things rarely happen in Denmark, but some piece of stupidity had certainly been performed, which is not so uncommon, and the chambermaid must be severely spoken to. Whatever it was that he wanted, it was not so necessary to his comfort he could not wait till the morning for it, and he therefore settled not to ring the bell and disturb the servants. He went to the window, the right-hand window it was, and looked out on the quiet street. There was a tall building opposite, with large spaces of dead wall. No passers-by, a dark night, and very little to be seen of any kind. The light was behind him, and he could see his own shadow clearly cast on the wall opposite. Also the shadow of the bearded man in number 11 on the left, who passed to and fro in shirt-sleeves once or twice, and was seen first brushing his hair, and later on in a nightgown. And the shadow of the occupant of number 13 on the right. This might be more interesting. Number 13 was, like himself, leaning on his elbows on the windowsill looking out into the street. He seemed to be a tall, thin man, or was it by any chance a woman? At least it was someone who covered his or her head with some kind of drapery before going to bed, and he thought must be possessed of a red lampshade, and the lamp must be flickering very much. There was a distinct playing up and down of a dull red light on the opposite wall. He craned out a little to see if he could make any more of the figure, but beyond a fold of some light, perhaps white material on the window-sill, he could see nothing. Now came a distant step in the street, and its approach seemed to recall number 13 to a sense of his exposed position, for very swiftly and suddenly he swept aside from the window, and his red light went out. Anderson, who had been smoking a cigarette, laid the end of it on the window-sill and went to bed. Next morning he was woken by the chambermaid with hot water, etc. He roused himself, and after thinking out the correct Danish words, said as distinctly as he could, "You must not move my portmanteau. Where is it?" As is not uncommon, the maid laughed and went away without making any distinct answer. Anderson, rather irritated, sat up in bed, intending to call her back, but he remained sitting up, staring straight in front of him. There was his portmanteau on its trestle, exactly where he had seen the porter put it when he first arrived. This was a rude shock for a man who prided himself on his accuracy of observation. How could it possibly have escaped him the night before? He did not pretend to understand. At any rate, there it was now. The daylight showed more than the portmanteau. It let the true proportions of the room with its 3 windows appear, and satisfied its tenant that his choice, after all, had not been a bad one. When he was almost dressed, he walked to the middle one of the 3 windows to look out at the weather. Another shock awaited him. Strangely unobservant he must have been last night. He could have sworn 10 times over that he had been smoking at the right-hand window the last thing before he went to bed, and yet here was his cigarette end on the sill of the middle window. He started to go down to breakfast. Rather late, but number 13 was later. Here were his boots still outside his door, a gentleman's boots. So then, number 13 was a man, not a woman. Just then he caught sight of the number at the door. It was 14. He thought he must have passed number 13 without noticing it. 3 stupid mistakes in 12 hours were too much for a methodical, accurate-minded man, so he turned back to make sure. The next number to 14 was number 12, his own room. There was no number 13 at all. After some minutes devoted to a careful consideration of everything he had had to eat and drink during the last 24 hours, Anderson decided to give the question up. If his sight or his brain were giving way, he would have plenty of opportunities for ascertaining that fact. If not, then he was evidently being treated to a very interesting experience. In either case, the development of events would certainly be worth watching. During the day, he continued his examination of the episcopal correspondence, which I have already summarized. To his disappointment, it was incomplete. Only one other letter could be found which referred to the affair of Mag Nicholas Franken. It was from the Bishop Jürgen Fries to Rasmus Nielsen. He said, "Although we are not in the least degree inclined to assent to your judgment concerning our court, and shall be prepared if need be to withstand you to the uttermost in that behalf, yet forasmuch as our trusty and well-beloved Mag Nicholas Franken, against whom you have dared to allege certain false and malicious charges, hath been suddenly removed from among us, it is apparent that the question for this time falls. But, forasmuch as you further allege that the Apostle and Evangelist St. John is, in his heavenly apocalypse, describes the Holy Roman Church under the guise and symbol of the Scarlet Woman, be it known to you, etc." Search as he might, Anderson could find no sequel to this letter, nor any clue to the cause or manner of the removal of the casus belli. He could only suppose that Franken had died suddenly, and as there were only 2 days between the date of Nielsen's last letter, when Franken was evidently still in being, and that of the bishop's letter, the death must have been completely unexpected. In the afternoon, he paid a short visit to Hald, and took his tea at Bakeland, nor could he notice, though he was in a somewhat nervous frame of mind, that there was any indication of such a failure of eye or brain, as his experiences of the morning had led him to fear. At supper, he found himself next to the landlord. "What," he asked him after some indifferent conversation, "is the reason why, in most of the hotels one visits in this country, the number 13 is left out of the list of rooms? I see you have none here." The landlord seemed amused. "To think that you should have noticed a thing like that. I've thought about it once or twice myself, to tell the truth. An educated man, I've said, has no business with these superstitious notions. I was brought up myself here in the high school of Viborg, and our old master was always a man to set his face against anything of that kind. He's been dead now this many years. A fine, upstanding man he was, and ready with his hands as well as his head. I recollect us boys, one snowy day." Here he plunged into a reminiscence. "Then you don't think there is any particular objection to having a number 13? said Anderson. "Ah, to be sure. Well, you understand, I was brought up to the business by my poor old father. He kept a hotel in Aarhus first, and then, when we were born, he moved to Viborg here, which was his native place, and had the Phoenix here until he died. That was in 1876. Then I started business in Silkeborg, and only the year before last I moved into this house." Then followed more details as to the state of the house and business when first taken over. And when you came here, was there a number 13? No, I was going to tell you about that. You see, in a place like this, the commercial class, the travellers, are what we have to provide for in general. And put them in number 13? Why, they'd as soon sleep in the street, or sooner. As far as I'm concerned, myself, it wouldn't make a penny difference to me what the number of my room was, and so I've often said to them. But they stick to it that it brings them bad luck. Quantities of stories they have among them of men that have slept in a number 13 and never been the same again, or lost their best customers, or one thing and another, said the landlord after searching for a more graphic phrase. Then what do you use your number 13 for? Said Anderson, conscious that he said the words of a curious anxiety quite disproportionate to the importance of the question. My number 13? Why, don't I tell you there isn't such a thing in the house? I thought you might have noticed that. If there was, it would be next door to your own room. Well, yes, only I happen to think... That is, I fancied last night that I had seen a door numbered 13 in that passage, and really I am almost certain I must have been right, for I saw it the night before as well. Of course, Herr Christensen laughed this notion to scorn, as Anderson had expected, and emphasized with much iteration the fact that no number 13 existed, or had existed before him, in that hotel. Anderson was in some ways relieved by his certainty, but still puzzled, and he began to think that the best way to make sure whether he had indeed been subject to an illusion or not was to invite the landlord to his room to smoke a cigar later on in the evening. Some photographs of English towns which he had with him formed a sufficiently good excuse. Herr Christensen was flattened by the invitation, and most willingly accepted it. At about 10 o'clock he was to make his appearance, but before that Anderson had some letters to write, and retired for the purpose of writing them. He almost blushed to himself at confessing it, but he could not deny that it was the fact that he was becoming quite nervous about the question of the existence of number 13, so much so that he approached his room by way of number 11, in order that he might not be obliged to pass the door, or the place where the door ought to be. He looked quickly and suspiciously about the room when he entered it, but there was nothing beyond the indefinable air of being smaller than usual to warrant any misgivings. There was no question of the presence or absence of his portmanteau tonight. He had himself emptied it of its contents and lodged it under his bed. With a certain effort, he dismissed the thought of number 13 from his mind and sat down to his writing. His neighbours were quiet enough. Occasionally a door opened in the passage and a pair of boots was thrown out, or a bagman walked past humming to himself, and outside, from time to time, a cart thundered over the atrocious cobblestones, or a quick step hurried along the flags. Anderson finished his letters, ordered in whisky and soda, and then went to the window and studied the dead wall opposite and the shadows upon it. As far as he could remember, number 14 had been occupied by the lawyer, a staid man, who said little at meals, being generally engaged in studying a small bundle of papers beside his plate. Apparently, however, he was in the habit of giving vent to his animal spirits when alone. Why else should he be dancing? The shadow from the next room evidently showed that he was. Again and again his thin form crossed the window, his arms waved, and a gaunt leg was kicked up with surprising agility. He seemed to be bare-footed, and the floor must be well laid, for no sound betrayed his movements. Sagfora Herr Anders Jensen, dancing at 10 o'clock at night in a hotel bedroom, seemed a fitting subject for a historical painting in the grand style, and Anderson's thoughts, like those of Emily in The Mysteries of Udolpho, began to arrange themselves in the following lines, which I will read once I've let Joey in. Arrange themselves in the following lines. When I return to my hotel at 10 o'clock p.m., the waiters think I am unwell. I do not care for them. But when I've locked my chamber door and put my boots outside, I dance all night upon the floor. And even if my neighbours swore, I'd go on dancing all the more, for I'm acquainted with the law, and in despite of all their jaw, their protests I deride. Had not the landlord at this moment knocked at the door, it is probable that quite a long poem might have been laid before the reader. To judge from his look of surprise when he found himself in the room, Herr Christensen was struck, as Andersen had been, by something unusual in its aspect. But he made no remark. Andersen's photographs interested him mightily, and formed the text of many autobiographical discourses. Nor is it quite clear how the conversation could have been diverted into the desired channel of number 13, had not the lawyer at this moment begun to sing, and to sing in a manner which could leave no doubt in anyone's mind that he was either exceedingly drunk or raving mad. It was a high, thin voice that they heard, and it seemed dry, as if from long disuse. Of words or tune there was no question. It went sailing up to a surprising height, and was carried down with a despairing moan, as if a winter wind in a hollow chimney, or an organ whose wind fails suddenly. It was a really horrible sound, and Andersen felt that if he had been alone, he must have fled for refuge and society to some neighbour bagman's room. The landlord sat open-mouthed. "I don't understand it," he said at last, wiping his forehead. "It's dreadful. I've heard it once before, but I made sure it was a cat." "Is he mad?" said Andersen. "He must be. And what a sad thing. Such a good customer too, and so successful in his business, by what I hear, and a young family to bring up." Just then came an impatient knock at the door, and the knocker entered without waiting to be asked. It was the lawyer in déshabillé. In déshabillé, and very rough-haired, and very angry he looked. "I beg pardon, sir," he said, "but I should be much obliged if you would kindly desist." Here he stopped, for it was evident that neither of the persons before him was responsible for the disturbance, and after a moment's lull it swelled forth again more wildly than before. "But what in the name of heaven does it mean?" broke out the lawyer. "Where is it? Who is it? Am I going out of my mind?" "Surely, Herr Jensen, it comes from your room next door. Isn't there a cat or something stuck in the chimney?" This was the best that occurred to Andersen to say, and he realized its futility as he spoke. But anything was better than to stand and listen to that horrible voice, and look at the broad, white face of the landlord, all perspiring and quivering as he clutched the arms of his chair. "Impossible," said the lawyer. "Impossible. There is no chimney. I came here because I was convinced the noise was going on here. It was certainly in the room next to mine." "Was there no door between yours and mine?" said Andersen eagerly. "No, sir," said Herr Jensen rather sharply. "At least, not this morning." "Ah," said Andersen, "nor tonight?" "I'm not sure," said the lawyer with some hesitation. Suddenly the crying or singing voice in the next room died away, and the singer was heard seemingly to laugh to himself in a crooning manner. The three men actually shivered at the sound. Then there was a silence. You might also be able to hear Joey purring away. He is looking for cuddles. "Come," said the lawyer. "What have you to say, Herr Christensen? What does this mean?" "Good heaven," said Christensen. "How should I tell? I know no more than you gentlemen. I pray I may never hear such a noise again." "So do I," said Herr Jensen, and he added something under his breath. Andersen thought it sounded like the last words of a psalter, "Omnis spiritus laudet Dominum," but he could not be sure. "But we must do something," said Andersen. The three of us. Shall we go and investigate in the next room?" I'm being assaulted by a cat who's desperately asking for fuss. "But that is Herr Jensen's room," wailed the landlord. "It is no use. He has come from there himself." "I am not so sure," said Jensen. "I think this gentleman is right. We must go and see." The only weapons of defence that could be mustered on the spot were a stick and umbrella. The expedition went out into the passage not without quakings. There was a deadly quiet outside, but a light shone from under the next door. Anderson and Jensen approached it. The latter turned the handle and gave a sudden vigorous push. No use. The door stood fast. "Herr Christensen," said Jensen, "will you go and fetch the strongest servant you have in the place? We must see this through." The landlord nodded and hurried off, glad to be away from the scene of action. Jensen and Anderson remained outside looking at the door. "It is number 13, you see," said the latter. "Yes, there is your door and there is mine," said Jensen. "My room has 3 windows in the daytime," said Anderson, with difficulty suppressing a nervous laugh. "By George, so is mine," said the lawyer, turning and looking at Anderson. His back was now to the door. In that moment the door opened, and an arm came out and clawed at his shoulder. It was clad in ragged yellowish linen, and bare skin, where it could be seen, had long grey hair upon it. Anderson was just in time to pull Jensen out of its reach, with a cry of disgust and fright, when the door shut again, and a low laugh was heard. Jensen had seen nothing, but when Anderson hurriedly told him what a risk he had run, he fell into a great state of agitation, and suggested that they should retire from the enterprise and lock themselves up in one or other of their rooms. However, while he was developing this plan, the landlord and 2 able-bodied men arrived on the scene, all looking rather serious and alarmed. Jensen met them with a torrent of description and explanation, which did not at all tend to encourage them for the fray. The men dropped the crowbars they had brought, and said flatly that they were not going to risk their throats in that devil's den. The landlord was miserably nervous and undecided, conscious that if the danger were not faced, his hotel was ruined, and very loath to face it himself. Luckily, Anderson hit upon a way of rallying the demoralized force. "Is this," he said, "the Danish courage I have heard so much of? It isn't a German in there, and if it was, we are 5 to 1. The 2 servants and Jensen were stung into action by this, and made a dash at the door. "Stop," said Anderson. "Don't lose your heads. You stay out here with the light, landlord, and one of you 2 men break in the door, and don't go in when it gives way." The men nodded, and the younger stepped forward, raised his crowbar, and dealt a tremendous blow on the upper panel. The result was not in the least what any of them anticipated. There was no cracking or rending of wood, only a dull sound, as if the solid wall had been struck. The man dropped his tool with a shout and began rubbing his elbow. His cry drew their eyes upon him for a moment. Then Anderson looked at the door again. It was gone. The plaster wall of the passage stared him in the face, with a considerable gash in it where the crowbar had struck it. Number 13 had passed out of existence. For a brief space they stood perfectly still, gazing at the blank wall. An early cock in the yard beneath was heard to crow, and as Anderson glanced in the direction of the sound, he saw through the window at the end of the long passage that the eastern sky was paling to the dawn. "Perhaps," said the landlord with hesitation, "you gentlemen would like another room for tonight? A double-bedded one?" Neither Jensen nor Anderson was averse to the suggestion. They felt inclined to hunt in couples after their late experience. It was found convenient, when each of them went to his room to collect the articles he wanted for the night, that the other should go with him and hold the candle. They noticed that both number 12 and number 14 had 3 windows. Next morning the same party reassembled in number 12. The landlord was naturally anxious to avoid engaging outside help, and yet it was imperative that the mystery attaching to that part of the house should be cleared up. Accordingly, the 2 servants had been induced to take upon them the function of carpenters. The furniture was cleared away, and, at the cost of a good many irretrievably damaged planks, that portion of the floor was taken up which lay nearest to number 14. You will naturally suppose that a skeleton, say that of Mag Nicholas Franken, was discovered. That was not so. What they did find lying between the beams which supported the flooring was a small copper box. In it was a neatly folded vellum document with about 20 lines of writing. Both Anderson and Jensen, who proved to be something of a paleographer, were much excited by this discovery, which promised to afford the key to these extraordinary phenomena. I possess a copy of an astrological work which I have never read. It has, by way of frontispiece, a woodcut by Hans Sebold Beham, representing a number of sages seated around a table. This detail may enable connoisseurs to identify the book. I cannot myself recollect its title, and it is not at this moment within reach, but the fly-leaves of it are covered with writing, and during the 10 years in which I have owned the volume, I have not been able to determine which way up this writing ought to be read, much less in what language it is. Not dissimilar was the position of Anderson and Jensen after the protracted examination to which they submitted the document in the copper box. After 2 days' contemplation of it, Jensen, who was the bolder spirit of the two, hazarded the conjecture that the language was either Latin or Old Danish. Anderson ventured upon no surmises, and was very willing to surrender the box and the parchment to the Historical Society of Viborg to be placed in their museum. I had the whole story from him a few months later, as we sat in a wood near Uppsala, after a visit to the library there, where we... Excuse me 1 second, I just got distracted by something. Where we, or rather I, had laughed over the contract by which Daniel Soltenius, in later life professor of Hebrew at Königsberg, sold himself to Satan. Anderson was not really amused. "Young idiot," he said, meaning Soltenius, who was only an undergraduate when he committed that indiscretion. "How did he know what company he was courting?" And when I suggested the usual considerations, he only grunted. That same afternoon he told me what you have read, but he refused to draw any inferences from it, and to assent to any that I drew for him. Thank you. That brings us to the end of the stories for tonight.